Preston Harrington I sneered as he raised the silver goblet over Morton's head. The 14-year-old's grin widened as the wine crashed down her face, dripping onto her gown while guests sucked in their breath. Melissa Harrington clapped like he'd performed a magic trick. "Good boy, Preston, she fits the part now," she crowed, lifting her phone to film. Gregory approached, eyes cold. "Try not to stain the carpet," he murmured. "These galas weren't designed for your kind." Aya didn't move. They had no idea they had just drenched the one woman capable of collapsing their empire with a single decision. Before we continue, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow across the marble floors of the Harrington Foundation's grand ballroom. Hundreds of guests in designer evening wear turned as Morton made her entrance, her peach silk gown catching the light. She moved with the confident grace that had become her trademark in the business world, acknowledging the scattered applause with a practiced smile. At 41, Aya commanded attention not through volume or flash, but through presence. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, offsetting diamond drop earrings that caught the light. She had built Brightwave Innovations from nothing into a clean energy powerhouse, but tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of a different kind, a $650 million partnership with Harrington Energy Group. It was a deal that would merge her cutting-edge technology with their legacy infrastructure. Aya walked toward the buffet, her mind sharp, calculating the final terms of the contract waiting in the study. She didn't notice the shadow following her. Preston Harrington the 14-year-old heir to the Harrington throne, stepped into her path. He didn't see the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. He didn't see the woman who was about to save his family from financial ruin. He saw someone he considered beneath his lineage. "You're in my way," the boy barked. Aya stopped, looking down at him with a calm, measured gaze. "The room is vast, Preston. Surely we can both exist in it." The boy's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being answered back. He looked toward his parents, who were watching from a distance with smirks of encouragement. To them, Preston's bullying was spirit. It was leadership. He reached for a glass of heavy red Cabernet. The wine didn't just splash. It was a calculated drenching. The liquid was cold, staining the peach silk instantly, turning the delicate fabric into a heavy, sodden weight. The guests fell into a hushed, horrified silence. Aya felt the wine drip from her chin, soaking into the lace of her bodice. She felt the sting of the alcohol in her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She didn't scream. Melissa Harrington stepped forward, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass. "Oh, Preston, you always did have an eye for style. She looks much more authentic now, don't you think?" Melissa raised her smartphone, the lens catching the light as she recorded the humiliation for her social circle. Gregory Harrington joined them, his tuxedo perfect, his expression one of bored contempt. He didn't reprimand his son. He didn't apologize. He leaned in close to Aya, the scent of expensive cigars clinging to his breath. "Don't make a scene, Aya," he whispered. "Clean yourself up. We have a contract to sign in 20 minutes. Consider this a reminder of the hierarchy. We provide the platform, you provide the labor." Aya looked at the three of them. She saw the boy's arrogance, the mother's cruelty, and the father's coldness. For years, she had fought to be in rooms like this. She had worked 20-hour days, endured the glass ceilings, and ignored the whispers. She realized in that moment that no amount of money or success would ever make her one of them in their eyes, and more importantly, she realized she no longer wanted to be. She reached for a silk napkin on the table, moving with a slowness that made the Harringtons uneasy. She wiped a stray drop of wine from her cheek. "You're right, Gregory," Aya said, her voice low and resonant, carrying through the silence of the room. This gala wasn't designed for my kind. My kind builds things. Your kind simply breaks them. Preston snickered, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes this time. Something in Aya's gaze had shifted. The victim they expected had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. Aya looked at the $650 million deal in her mind. The signatures, the handshake, the salvation of the Harrington name. She thought about the employees at Harrington Energy who were depending on this deal, and then she looked at the man leading them. "Wait for me in the study, Gregory," Aya said, her voice steady. "I need to go change." Gregory nodded, satisfied. 10 minutes, don't be late, time is money." As Aya turned and walked away, her ruined gown trailing behind her, she didn't head for the guest suites to find a spare dress. She didn't head for the powder room to cry. She headed for the exit. She pulled her phone from her clutch. The screen glowed in the dim hallway. She dialed her chief legal officer. "Marcus, it's Aya. Pull the Harrington contract, cancel the wire transfer, and tell the board we're going to war." The ballroom was still buzzing with the excitement of Aya's humiliation, but the atmosphere was about to turn ice cold. Gregory Harrington stood in the center of his empire, champagne in hand, laughing at a joke made at Aya's expense. But then, a rhythmic vibration started in the pockets of every board member in the room. One by one, faces turned from smug satisfaction to ghostly pale. Gregory pulled out his device. His eyes widened. The headline on the Bloomberg terminal read, "Brightwave Innovations terminates $650 M merger with Harrington Energy, effective immediately." The room went silent, not the respectful silence of a gala, but the suffocating silence of a sinking ship. Gregory looked up, searching for the woman in the stained peach dress, but Aya Morton was already gone. Aya Morton didn't look back as she stepped into the cool night air. Behind her, the Harrington mansion looked like a glowing mausoleum, a tomb for a legacy that was about to be buried. She sat in the back of her black sedan, the scent of spilled Cabernet still clinging to her skin, but her mind was already light years away, executing a sequence of financial maneuvers that would make Wall Street tremble. "Marcus," she said into her phone, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "Is it done?" "It's done, Aya," her lawyer replied. "The withdrawal notice has been filed. The SEC has been notified of ethical irregularities within the Harrington Group. By 9:00 a.m. tomorrow, their credit lines will be frozen." Back inside the ballroom, the panic was viral. Gregory Harrington was pushing through the crowd, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He reached the study where the contract was supposed to be signed. The leather folder was there. The fountain pen was there. But the signature line for Aya Morton was a haunting, empty white space. "Find her," Gregory screamed at his security detail. "I don't care if you have to drag her back here. If that money doesn't hit our accounts by midnight, the banks will seize the tower." Melissa Harrington followed him, her phone still in her hand, but she wasn't filming anymore. She was watching the Harrington stock price ticker. It was a bloodbath. The market had reacted to the news of the cancelled deal with brutal efficiency. "Gregory, what's happening?" Melissa hissed, her voice trembling. "The shares, they've dropped 15% in 10 minutes. "Your son," Gregory growled, turning on her like a cornered animal. "Your spirited little boy just poured $650 million down the drain. He didn't just wet a dress, Melissa, he drowned us." At the edge of the room, Preston stood alone. The silver goblet he had used to humiliate Aya was now lying forgotten on the floor. For the first time in his life, the boy felt the cold breath of reality. He looked at his father, the man he thought was invincible, and saw a man who was terrified. Aya, meanwhile, was not finished. She knew that stopping the deal was only the first step. To truly dismantle a monster, you have to starve it. She opened her laptop. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car, reflecting in her eyes. She looked at a file labeled Project Glass House. For months, her intelligence team had been quietly documenting the Harringtons' internal rot. She had intended to use this information to clean up the company after the merger. But now it was ammunition. Aya Marcus's voice came over the speaker. The Harrington board is calling an emergency session. They want to offer you a seat on the executive committee. They're offering to fire Gregory if you come back to the table. Aya leaned back against the leather seat. She looked at the red wine stain on her sleeve, a permanent mark on a priceless dress. Tell them no, Aya whispered. Tell them I'm not interested in a seat at their table. I'm interested in the table itself. The car pulled up to her private residence. As she stepped out, she saw a shadow waiting by her gate. It was an elderly woman, dressed in a simple wool coat, clutching a tattered leather bag to her chest. Aya paused. Can I help you? The woman stepped into the light. Her face was a map of hard years and hidden secrets. My name is Elena, she said, her voice shaking but certain. I worked for the Harringtons for 27 years. I saw what the boy did tonight on the news, and I decided I couldn't keep their secrets for a 28th year. Aya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. What kind of secrets, Elena? The old woman opened the leather bag. Inside were dozens of handwritten ledgers and small microcassette tapes. Gregory Harrington Sr. started the fire, Elena said, looking Aya directly in the eyes. But Gregory Jr. is the one who's been burning the bodies. They didn't need your money for an expansion, Ms. Morton. They needed it to hide $100 million fraud. Aya took the bag. She felt the weight of it. This wasn't just evidence. It was the final nail in the coffin. Elena, Aya said softly, why tell me this now? Because, the woman replied, for 27 years, they made me feel invisible, just like they tried to make you look filthy tonight. I want them to see what an invisible woman can do. The war was no longer about a ruined dress. It was no longer about a broken deal. Aya Morton walked into her house, the bag of secrets in one hand and her phone in the other. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a different world. A world where the Harringtons would learn that the people they looked down upon were the very ones holding up their ceiling. And when that ceiling came crashing down, there would be no crystal chandeliers to catch them. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun, it's a ledger. Aya Morton sat in her dim study, the only light coming from the glowing screen of her laptop and the yellowed pages provided by Elena. Outside, the world thought the story was about a ruined dress and a cancelled deal. But as Aya flipped through the handwritten notes of a woman who had been invisible for 27 years, she realized she was looking at the DNA of a crime family. Gregory Harrington hadn't just been arrogant, he had been desperate, and as Aya's eyes scanned a specific entry from 3 years ago, her blood ran cold. The Harringtons didn't just pour wine on her, they had poured it on the one person who could decode their destruction. The morning sun rose over the city, but for the Harrington Energy Group, it was the start of a long, dark eclipse. By 8:00 a.m., the lobby of Harrington Tower was swarming with reporters. The news of the $650 million withdrawal had sent the company's valuation into a tailspin, losing nearly $100 million in paper wealth before the opening bell even rang. Inside her home, Aya Morton sipped black coffee, her eyes red from a night of reading. Elena sat across from her, her hands trembling as she held a porcelain cup. They thought I was just the help, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. They talked in front of me as if I were a piece of furniture. Gregory would brag to Melissa about the offshore accounts while I was polishing the silver right next to them. Aya looked down at the ledger. Elena, Do you realize what this is? This isn't just bad bookkeeping. This is a systematic $100 million embezzlement scheme. The documents revealed a terrifying truth. The Harringtons had been skimming money from their own pension funds to pay for their lavish lifestyle, the galas, the private jets, and Preston's elite schooling. The $650 million deal with Aya's company, Brightwave, wasn't for innovation. It was a giant band-aid meant to cover the hole in their accounts before the federal auditors arrived. Aya picked up her phone. She didn't call the press. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She called Gregory Harrington's private line. It picked up on the first ring. Gregory's voice was frantic, breathless. Aya, listen to me. Whatever you want, we can make it happen. You want a public apology? I'll make Preston go on his knees on national television. Just reinstate the wire transfer. The banks are closing in. Aya looked at the wine-stained peach dress hanging on the back of her door. A silent reminder. Gregory, she said, her voice like a velvet blade. I'm not calling about the money. I'm calling about the invisible people in your house, the ones you think don't have eyes. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Silence, a long, heavy silence. What are you talking about? Gregory hissed. I'm talking about Elena Reed, Aya replied. And I'm talking about the leather bag she just handed me, the one that lists every offshore account from the Cayman Islands to Luxembourg. The sound of a glass shattering echoed through the phone. Gregory had dropped his drink. That woman is a thief, Gregory growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and pure, unadulterated fear. She's a disgruntled servant. No one will believe her. They don't have to believe her, Gregory, Aya said calmly. They just have to follow the trail she left. I've already sent the first 10 pages to the Department of Justice. The rest, well, that depends on how you spend the next hour. Aya hung up. She knew the Harringtons would strike back. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous when it realizes the cage is closing. Within 30 minutes, Aya's security team alerted her. A black SUV had pulled up to the end of her driveway, then another. The Harringtons weren't coming to negotiate, they were coming to intimidate. But Aya was 3 steps ahead. She had already moved Elena to a secure location. She had already mirrored the files to 3 different cloud servers across the globe. She walked to her window and looked out. She saw the men in dark suits standing by the gate. She saw the desperation of a dynasty trying to protect its lies. She turned back to her computer and hit send on a pre-drafted email to the Brightwave Board of Directors. Subject: immediate acquisition strategy. We are no longer partnering with Harrington Energy. We are absorbing them, piece by piece, starting with their reputation. Aya realized that the wine Preston poured on her wasn't a stain. It was a baptism. It had washed away her hesitation. It had shown her exactly who she was fighting. She picked up a fresh white suit, the fabric crisp and untainted. As she dressed, she watched the news ticker. The Harrington board was in a state of mutiny. Investors were demanding Gregory's resignation. But Aya knew that resignation wasn't enough. For 27 years, people like Elena had suffered in the shadows of this family's greed. For 27 years, they had built their palace on the backs of those they called filthy. Preston wanted to see how I looked in crystal, Aya whispered to the empty room. Now, I'm going to show him how he looks behind bars. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the front of the house. The gate had been breached, the Harringtons' legal team, and there, at her door. Aya didn't hide, she didn't call for help. She walked straight to the front door and opened it. Standing there wasn't a lawyer. It was Melissa Harrington. Her eyes were wild, her makeup smeared, and in her hand, she held the very phone she had used to film Aya's humiliation. Delete the files, Aya, Melissa screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. "Delete them or I will ruin you. I have videos. I have things that will destroy your reputation." Aya looked at the woman who had laughed while her son assaulted a guest. She looked at the woman who thought a video could stop a revolution. "Melissa," Aya said, stepping out onto the porch, her head held high. "The difference between you and me is simple. You care about how you look. I care about what I am. Some secrets don't just hide in the dark, they scream." Melissa Harrington stood on Aya's porch, her hand trembling as she gripped her phone, the same phone that held the footage of Aya's humiliation. She thought she was holding a winning hand. She thought a video of a woman covered in wine would break a CEO's spirit. But as the wind picked up, Aya stepped closer, her shadow engulfing Melissa. "You think a viral video can stop what's coming?" Aya whispered. "Pause, Melissa. I've spent the last 4 hours listening to your husband's voice, not the voice he uses for speeches, the voice he uses when he thinks the help is invisible." Aya held up a small, black microcassette. "This is the sound of your empire cracking." Aya didn't wait for Melissa to respond. She turned and walked back into her home, leaving the door wide open, an invitation for the predator to see that the prey was no longer afraid. Melissa followed, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. She found Aya in the study, where a vintage tape player sat on the desk. Aya pressed play. "It doesn't matter if the pension funds are short, Gregory," a voice hissed from the speakers. It was Melissa's own voice, recorded years ago in the privacy of their library. "The staff are too stupid to read their own statements. Just move the $100 million into the offshore shell. By the time they notice, we'll have sold the company to some fool like Morton." Melissa's face drained of color. The phone slipped from her hand, hitting the rug with a dull thud. "Elena was there," Aya said, her voice devoid of pity. "She was polishing the mahogany while you were plotting to steal the life savings of 5,000 employees. You didn't just ignore her, Melissa. You forgot she was human." But the tapes went deeper. There were recordings of Gregory Harrington Sr. discussing agreements with city officials to dump toxic runoff into local water supplies, the very runoff that Brightwave Innovations was currently being paid to clean up. The irony was a jagged pill. The Harringtons had been paying Aya to fix the crimes they were still actively committing. Suddenly, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of rotors. Aya walked to the window. 2 black helicopters with Federal Bureau of Investigation stenciled in yellow were descending toward the Harrington estate just 3 miles away. Simultaneously, 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of Aya's driveway. This time it wasn't Harrington fixers. A team of agents in tactical gear stepped out, led by a woman with a sharp suit and a sharper gaze. Agent Sarah Vance. "Aya Morton?" Vance asked as she entered the house, her eyes immediately landing on the sobbing Melissa Harrington. "I've been expecting you, Agent," Aya said, handing over the leather bag and the microcassettes. "The ledgers are in the bag, the offshore account numbers are on page 42, and the recordings of the pension fraud. Well, you just heard a sample." Melissa tried to lung for the tapes, but a federal agent caught her arm. "Mrs. Harrington, you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." "You can't do this," Melissa shrieked. "Do you know who we are? We are the Harringtons." Agent Vance didn't even look up from the ledger. "Actually, ma'am, according to these books, you're currently $200 million in the red, which means who you are is officially bankrupt." As Melissa was led out in handcuffs, Aya felt a strange sensation. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was the heavy, cold weight of justice finally finding its balance. But the battle wasn't over. Gregory was still at the Harrington Tower, and he was a man who preferred to burn everything down rather than lose. Aya's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "I'm in the server room, Aya. He's trying to delete the digital trail. You have 5 minutes before the Harrington servers go dark forever. E." Elena, the invisible woman, was still inside the belly of the beast. Aya turned to Agent Vance. "The physical evidence is here, but the digital proof of the $100 million transfer is being wiped right now at Harrington Tower. Gregory is destroying the evidence." Vance grabbed her radio. "All units, we have a code 1031 at Harrington Tower. Suspect is destroying evidence. Move, move, move." Aya grabbed her coat. "I'm coming with you." "It's a crime scene, Ms. Morton," Vance argued. "No," Aya said, her eyes flashing like steel. "It's my acquisition, and I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the filthy woman he drenched in wine just bought his soul." The ride to Harrington Tower was a blur of sirens and blue lights. The city seemed to stand still as the motorcade tore through the streets. People pulled over, staring at the sight of the mighty Harrington Empire being sieged. As they reached the tower, Aya saw smoke. Gregory wasn't just deleting files. He had set fire to the mainframe. He was willing to burn the entire building to the ground to keep his secrets buried. "The elevators are locked," an agent shouted. "The stairwells are filling with smoke," another yelled. Aya looked up at the top floor, the penthouse office where Gregory Harrington sat. She knew Elena was somewhere in that building. The man who laughed while his son poured wine was now watching his world turn to ash. But he forgot one thing. Pause. Aya Morton didn't just build companies, she knew how to survive the fire. When a man's world burns, he either runs from the fire or he becomes the monster within it. The Harrington Tower was no longer a symbol of power. It was a chimney. Black, acrid smoke billowed from the 40th floor, choking the pristine glass and steel. As the fire alarms wailed, a high-pitched scream that echoed across the city, Gregory Harrington stood in the server room, the orange glow of the flames dancing in his eyes. He wasn't trying to save his company, he was trying to erase his sins. But as the heat rose, he heard a sound that chilled him more than the fire scorched him. The sound of high heels clicking steadily against the floor. Through the haze of smoke, a silhouette appeared, Aya Morton. The air in the server room was thick, with the smell of melting plastic and ozone. Gregory spun around, a gasoline canister still in his hand, his expensive silk tie loosened and scorched. "How did you get in here?" he hissed, coughing as the smoke filled his lungs. Aya didn't answer immediately. She stood there, a white silk scarf wrapped around her mouth and nose, her eyes fixed on the man who had tried to humiliate her only hours before. She looked at the server racks, the digital brain of the Harrington Empire, which were now melting into a useless pile of slag. "The service stairs, Gregory," Aya said, her voice muffled but commanding. "The same stairs your staff use every day while you look right through them. They guided me, and they guided the FBI." Gregory laughed, a wild, jagged sound. "You're too late. The $100 million transfer records, the offshore logs, the evidence of the toxic dumping. It's all gone. In 5 minutes, there won't be a single byte of data left to prove anything." Aya stepped forward, the heat radiating off the servers, singeing the air between them. "You always were a fool, Gregory. You think power is something you can delete. You think history is something you can burn." "Where is Elena?" Aya demanded. Gregory's eyes darted toward the back of the room near the ventilation shaft. "The old hag, she tried to stop me. She tried to download the backup onto a physical drive." He sneered, a drop of sweat trailing through the soot on his face. She's lucky if she made it to the stairwell before the ceiling collapsed. Aya's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't care about the money anymore. She didn't care about the $650 million deal or the stock prices. She cared about the woman who had spent 27 years being invisible so that she could finally speak the truth. Suddenly, a muffled thud came from behind a fallen rack. Aya didn't hesitate. She lunged toward the sound, ignoring the heat that threatened to blister her skin. She pushed aside a heavy metal panel, and there she was. Elena. The elderly woman was slumped against the wall, clutching a small, silver external hard drive to her chest like it was a holy relic. "I got it," Elena whispered, her voice a mere thread. "The secondary backup, everything he tried to burn, it's in here." Gregory saw the drive. His face transformed from fear to murderous rage. He realized that as long as that drive existed, he was a dead man walking. "Give it to me," he roared, lunging toward the weakened Elena. But Aya was faster. She stepped between them, her stature dwarfing the crumbling man in front of her. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and held it like a weapon. "Don't," Aya warned, her voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. "You've spent your whole life stepping on people, Gregory, but today, the floor is gone." Outside, the sound of the FBI's breaching charges echoed through the building. The doors to the server room burst open. Agent Vance and her team swarmed in, masks on, weapons drawn. "Drop the canister, Harrington," Vance shouted. Gregory looked at the agents, then at Aya, then at the fire he had started. He realized he was surrounded by the very things he hated: the law, the truth, and a woman who refused to be broken. He dropped the gasoline can. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. As the agents tackled Gregory to the ground, Aya knelt beside Elena. She took the hard drive, its metal casing warm from the fire. "You did it, Elena," Aya said softly. "You're not invisible anymore." The agents began to evacuate them, oxygen masks being pressed onto their faces. As Aya was led out of the burning room, she passed Gregory. He was being dragged out in handcuffs, his face pressed against the cold floor. Aya stopped. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "You told me not to stain your carpet, Gregory," she whispered, her voice cold enough to put out the flames. "But look at you. You're covered in soot. You're covered in lies, and you're covered in the shame of a boy who never grew up." "And the best part," Aya smiled, a slow, lethal curve of the lips, "I'm going to use that $650 million I saved to buy your company's ruins. I'm going to turn Harrington Tower into a shelter for the people you exploited. Your name will be the first thing I scrape off the glass." Gregory tried to speak, but he only choked on the smoke of his own making. As Aya emerged from the building into the night air, the cameras of 100 news stations flashed at once. She was covered in soot. Her white suit was ruined. She looked exhausted, battered, and singed. But as she held the hard drive up for the world to see, she had never looked more powerful. The fall of a dynasty doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with the sound of a key turning in a lock. While the fires at Harrington Tower were being extinguished, another fire was just beginning. A fire that would consume every luxury, every privilege, and every drop of arrogance the Harrington name had ever carried. Preston Harrington III sat in the back of a luxury SUV, his eyes glued to his phone. He was waiting for his father to call. He was waiting for the fix to happen. But the only thing he saw on his screen was the face of Aya Morton, covered in soot, standing like a titan in front of his family's burning skyscraper. Then the car stopped, not at the gates of his mansion, but at the edge of a world he didn't recognize. The engine died. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Preston looked out the tinted window. They weren't at the Harrington estate. They were in front of a cold, grey government building. The door opened. It wasn't his private driver standing there. It was a man in a windbreaker with U.S. Marshal printed in bold, yellow letters. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Harrington," the officer said. His voice didn't have the deferential tone Preston had heard his entire life. It was flat, final. "Do you know who my father is?" Preston snapped, his voice cracking. He reached for his silver-plated flask, a habit he'd picked up to mimic his father's sophistication. The marshal didn't flinch. "I know exactly who your father is, kid. He's currently being processed in cell block C, and since this vehicle, your house, and every bank account with the Harrington name has been seized under the RICO Act, you're walking from here." Preston stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The air felt different here. It didn't smell like expensive cologne and floor wax. It smelled of exhaust and reality. Behind him, another car pulled up. Melissa Harrington emerged, but the woman who had laughed while Aya was drenched in wine was gone. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her hair, usually a perfect golden crown, was matted with sweat. She wasn't wearing her diamonds. The FBI had taken them as evidence of ill-gotten gains before she left the precinct on bail. "Mom," Preston ran to her, his bravado finally shattering. "Where are we going? Where is the staff? Why isn't anyone answering the phones?" Melissa looked at her son, and for the first time, she saw the monster she had created. She saw the boy who thought he could pour wine on a queen and stay a prince. "There is no staff, Preston," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The accounts are frozen. The house is taped off. We have nowhere to go." Meanwhile, at a sleek, quiet hospital across town, Aya Morton sat by Elena, bedside. The room was filled with the scent of fresh lilies. The $100 million embezzlement proof sat in a secure digital vault, and the hard drive Elena had risked her life for was now in the hands of the most ruthless prosecutors in the country. "You should rest, Aya," Elena said, her voice stronger now. "You've won." Aya looked at her hands. The soot was gone, but she could still feel the heat of the fire. "Winning isn't just about their defeat, Elena. It's about the people they stepped on to get there." Aya picked up her tablet. The news was a landslide. The Harrington Energy Group's board had officially dissolved. Shareholders were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, but Aya wasn't watching the stock market. She was watching a live feed of the Harrington mansion. She watched as federal agents carried out the velvet paintings. She watched as they towed away the fleet of Italian sports cars. And then she saw it. The cameras caught a glimpse of Preston and Melissa standing on a street corner, clutching a few designer bags, all they were allowed to keep. They looked small. They looked invisible. "Marcus," Aya spoke into her headset, "initiate the legacy project." "Are you sure, Aya?" her lawyer asked. "It's a massive investment. You could just let the company die and buy the assets for pennies later." "No," Aya said, her voice echoing with earned authority. "I don't want their assets. I want their atonement. I want every employee who lost their pension to be paid back in full, with interest. And the Harrington Mansion, I want the title transferred to the Elena Reed Foundation for Domestic Workers." The world was watching. The story of the rich boy and the wine had become a global symbol for the end of the unstoppable elite. In a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, the only place Melissa's sister would let them stay, Preston sat on a lumpy mattress. He turned on the television. Aya Morton was giving a press conference. She looked radiant in a simple, professional suit. "The Harringtons believed that wealth was a shield," Aya told the cameras. "They believed that people could be bought, sold, or soaked in wine for a laugh, but they forgot that the foundation of any empire isn't gold. It's the people who build the palace." Preston watched as Aya announced that the Harrington ballroom, the very place where he had tried to humiliate her, was being gutted. It was being turned into a community center and a training hub for underprivileged entrepreneurs. He looked down at his hands. For the first time, he realized they weren't royal. They were just empty. "Mom," Preston said, tears finally welling in his eyes. "What do we do now?" Melissa didn't look up from the floor. "We wait, Preston. We wait for the trials. And then we learn how to survive in the world we mocked." But Aya Morton wasn't waiting. She was moving forward. The wine stains on her peach dress would never come out, but she didn't want them to. They were a map, a reminder of where she had been and the fire she had walked through to get here. Desperation is a ghost. It haunts the hallways of those who thought they were gods. The courthouse didn't smell like the Harrington ballroom. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the cold, unyielding weight of the law. Gregory Harrington sat at the defense table, his $5,000 suit hanging loose on a frame that had aged 10 years in 10 days. His eyes were bloodshot, staring at the back of Aya Morton's head as she sat in the front row of the gallery. He had lost his company, he had lost his mansion, but as the lead prosecutor opened the leather bag, the one Elena had guarded for decades, Gregory realized he was about to lose his freedom. But a man like Gregory doesn't go down without one last, poisonous strike. The trial of the people versus Harrington was the event of the decade. Outside, protesters held signs featuring the wine pour video, now a global symbol of systemic cruelty. Inside, the atmosphere was lethal. "The prosecution calls Elena Reed to the stand," the bailiff announced. The room went silent. Elena walked slowly, her small frame looking fragile against the oak-paneled walls. As she passed Gregory, he leaned in, his voice a barely audible hiss. "Remember the non-disclosure agreement, Elena? I'll sue you into the dirt before you finish your sentence." Elena didn't flinch. She took her seat, placed her hand on the Bible, and looked Gregory directly in the eyes. "I remember everything, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "I remember the night you instructed the technicians to bypass the safety filters at the creek. I remember the checks you signed to charities that were actually offshore accounts for the board's vacations. And I remember how you laughed when you thought no one was listening." The Harrington legal team, led by a man known as the Shark, stood up. "Objection! The witness is a disgruntled former employee with a history of theft," the lawyer roared. He held up a file. "We have evidence that Elena Reed stole silverware and jewelry from the Harrington estate over a period of 20 years. Her testimony is nothing but a cover for her own crimes." The gallery gasped. Melissa Harrington smirked from her seat, a flicker of her old arrogance returning. Aya Morton watched from the pews. She knew this was coming. Gregory's defense wasn't about proving his innocence. It was about destroying the character of those who dared to speak the truth. But Aya had a card that Gregory didn't know she was holding. During the lunch recess, the hallways were a swarm of cameras. Gregory cornered Aya near the elevators, his security detail, now just two haggard men in cheap suits, blocking the path. "You think you've won, don't you?" Gregory growled, his face inches from hers. "By the time my lawyers are done with that maid, she'll be the one in a cell. And then, I'm coming for Brightwave. I'll claim you coerced her. I'll claim you fabricated the tapes." Aya didn't blink. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, translucent envelope. Inside was a tiny, gold-plated lapel pin. "Do you remember this, Gregory?" she asked. Gregory's eyes narrowed. "What is it, Maury Trash?" "It's a digital recorder," Aya whispered. "Preston wore it on his blazer the night of the gala. He thought it was a spy toy he'd bought online. He forgot to turn it off when he went into your study to brag about pouring the wine." Gregory's face turned a sickly shade of grey. The microphone is military grade, Aya continued, her voice like ice. It didn't just catch Preston's laughter. It caught the phone call you made 5 minutes later, the call where you told your broker to dump the remaining pension stocks before the $650 million deal falls through. That's not just embezzlement, Gregory. That's insider trading, and it's a federal felony with a mandatory 20-year sentence. The elevator dinged. Aya stepped inside. The boy you raised to be a monster just provided the evidence to cage you, she said as the doors began to close. He really does take after his father. The afternoon session was a slaughter. When the prosecution played the audio from the gold pin, the defense team sat down. There was no shark left in the room, just a man who had realized his own son had accidentally sealed his fate. As the jury left to deliberate, the news broke. The Harrington Energy Group had officially declared bankruptcy, but more importantly, the court had granted an emergency injunction. The legacy project was a go. Aya stood on the courthouse steps, the sun finally breaking through the clouds. She watched as Preston was led away by his mother, both of them ducking their heads to hide from the cameras. They were no longer the stars of the show, they were the cautionary tale. But as Aya turned to leave, a man in a dark coat approached her. He wasn't a reporter, he wasn't a lawyer. "Ms. Morton," the man said, sliding a manila envelope toward her. "There's one more thing you should know. Gregory wasn't working alone. The $100 million wasn't just for his lifestyle. He was paying off someone much higher up." Aya opened the envelope, her breath hitched. The conspiracy didn't end with the Harringtons. It reached into the very heart of the city's political machine. The ultimate victory isn't seeing your enemy fall. It's building something beautiful on top of the ruins they left behind. The Harrington ballroom was unrecognizable, gone were the heavy velvet drapes that hid the secrets of a dying dynasty. Gone were the guards who patrolled the perimeter to keep the help in their place. The air was no longer thick with the smell of expensive cigars and arrogance. Instead, the room was filled with the sound of hope. Aya Morton stood in the center of the hall, exactly where she had stood months ago with wine dripping from her face. But today, the peach silk dress was gone. Today, she wore the mantle of a woman who had not just survived a scandal, she had engineered a revolution. The final verdict had been read. Gregory Harrington had been sentenced to 25 years for fraud, embezzlement, and environmental crimes. Melissa, stripped of her assets and her social standing, was serving 5 years for her role in the cover-up. And Preston was now a ward of the state, attending a mandatory reform program where he spent his afternoons cleaning city parks, learning the value of the very filth he once mocked. But Aya wasn't thinking about the Harringtons. She was looking at the transformation of their legacy. Using the $650 million she had saved by walking away from the deal, Aya had purchased the Harrington Tower and the estate at an auction. She didn't tear them down. She did something far more powerful. She turned the Harrington estate into the Elena Reed Institute for Social Justice. The Grand Ballroom, once a temple of exclusion, was now a hub for activists, domestic workers, and young entrepreneurs. On this night, the room was packed. There were no diamond-encrusted socialites. There were people like Elena, the invisible ones, now standing in the light. Elena walked up to Aya, her face glowing with a peace she hadn't known for 30 years. She looked at the wall where a massive portrait used to hang. Now, there was a simple, framed peach silk dress, the very one Preston had ruined. "The wine stains never came out," Elena remarked, touching the glass frame. "Good," Aya replied, her voice steady and proud. "Some things shouldn't be erased. They should be transformed. Every time I look at those stains, I remember that they tried to humiliate me. And instead, They gave me the fuel to burn their house down. Aya walked to the podium, the same podium where she had once stood in silence while the world laughed. But tonight, as she tapped the microphone, the silence that followed was one of profound respect. Power, Aya began, her voice echoing through the hall, is not something you inherit. It is not something you pour from a bottle. True power is the ability to stand still when the world tries to move you. It is the ability to look at those who call you filthy and realize that they are the ones who are truly stained. The Harringtons believed that their name protected them. They believed that money could buy silence, but they forgot that the foundations of this city were built by the very hands they refused to shake. Today, we reclaim this space. This ballroom no longer belongs to a name. It belongs to a purpose. The room erupted. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of the elite. It was the roar of 1,000 voices who had finally been heard. As the party continued, Aya moved through the crowd. She saw young activists networking with veteran whistleblowers. She saw lawyers exchanging cards with community organizers. The Institute was already creating the connections that would prevent the next Gregory Harrington from rising. Aya made her way toward the grand exit. The same doors that had witnessed her humiliation now opened onto a future she had helped create. She took one last look at the ballroom, the peach dress in its glass case, the diverse crowd, and Alina laughing with a group of students. She had done more than survive shame. She had reclaimed her own terms. She stepped out into the cool night air. Her car was waiting, but she didn't get in immediately. She looked up at the stars. The sky was clear, the air was clean. The war was over, the empire had fallen, and from the ashes, something indestructible had grown. Aya walked away, her head held high, each step echoing with the earned authority of a woman who had faced the fire and come out as steel. Behind her, the doors closed softly, marking not an ending, but a continuation of the work she had chosen. If you enjoyed the story of Aya's ultimate revenge and the fall of the Harringtons, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss the next epic journey. On the screen right now, I have picked 2 special stories just for you, stories of justice, power, and secrets revealed. What did you think of Preston's fate? Tell me in the comments below. Have a wonderful day. And remember, the world is watching.